So, this is our introduction. Okay. And we're going to be digging into the foundation of the American legal system. And this isn't just a history lesson, it's an exploration of why the laws that govern our lives exist the way that they do. Where did they come from and how did they continue to evolve? Okay. But we need to start before America even had a government. So we have to go way, way back to a time again where there was no government. There was no Congress, no constitution, not even a flag. There was just a land, some opportunity, and a whole lot of uncertainty. And the early American settlers, like they didn't just come here because, they wanted to escape some mild weather or like, get away on like a long boat ride. They weren't going on cruises or anything. They came here in large part to escape religious persecution. And we'll say to also, seize some new economic opportunities. But imagine leaving everything you know behind, your home, your extended family, things like that, because the laws in your country dictated how you should worship, who you could marry, what jobs you were allowed to hold. So these settlers, they came here and they arrived with hope, but they also came with baggage. And I'm not talking like literal baggage, I'm talking legal baggage. Okay. They brought with them the legal traditions of their homelands, and that included deeply ingrained attitudes about morality and religion. And under those traditions, many acts that were considered sinful were also illegal. So, in other words, the law wasn't just about keeping order, it was about enforcing morality. And in these early communities, if you disobeyed the church, you risked punishment not just in the afterlife, but in court. So law and religion were deeply intertwined. So crimes like adultery or blasphemy or breaking the Sabbath, those weren't just social taboos, okay? They were actual legal offenses. They were punishable by fines, public shaming, or, sometimes even worse. But the legal system didn't just reflect what was considered right, it enforced what was considered holy, okay? But as the populations of the colonies grew, things began to change because the New World wasn't just filling up with people, it was attracting attention. So you have foreign governments, particularly Britain, beginning to assert more control. And they set up government offices. They appoint these colonial authorities. They impose taxes on American goods and natural resources. And the more prosperous the colonies became, the more other nations wanted a piece of that wealth. Okay. And so to the colonists, this increasing foreign control felt more like a creeping invasion, not with armies, like per se, but like with paperwork and policies. And many of these colonists had left Europe specifically to escape oppressive rule. And so they didn't want to replace one form of control with another. And they didn't want to live under another government that felt distant, unaccountable, unresponsive to their needs. In this growing tension, it led to a critical realization that the colonies couldn't stay independent and disorganized forever. They needed a permanent structure of government, and it was one that needed to be able to protect their communities, to like coordinate their efforts, and to represent their interest. And so they needed the ability to govern locally. They needed to be able to handle disputes, enforce laws, maintain order, things like that. And they needed a system that could unite them in defense against these foreign threats. And some colonists thought that each area should form its own independent nation. And, most recognize that basically as a survival that required unity. Okay. And as appealing as independence was on paper, the reality was clear. They were stronger together. And so the push began not just for freedom from foreign rule, but for a united front, a permanent structure that came with a new kind of government, one that wasn't built on a monarchy, but on mutual interest, one that wouldn't just enforce laws, but it would reflect the values of the people that it governed. And in that moment, before the government even existed, you can already see how the seeds of American law was being planted. And that was a deep respect for personal freedom, a skepticism of unchecked authority, and a belief that government should serve, not control the people. Okay. And that belief would go on to ultimately shape revolutions, constitutions, and courtrooms for centuries to come. Now, let's talk about a philosophy that kind of quietly guided early American law, even before there was a formal legal system in place, and that's the naturalist theory. And this is rooted in a simple but powerful idea that all people, by virtue of being human, are born with the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. So it suggests that morality isn't something that we have to be taught from books or government. It's something that we instinctively know. It's in us basically from the start. Okay. So to understand how this influenced early law, imagine that you have a small colonial village. Okay. There's no police department, no judge in a robe, no law books. You just have this group of settlers that are trying to survive. Okay. There were no formal like legal codes to refer to in those first days, but there was still an expectation of how people should behave. And when someone broke those unspoken rules, say by stealing from a neighbor or lying to a community elder or cheating someone in a trade, they weren't just violating a social norm. They were treated as if they had committed a moral offense, a sin, a crime. The assumption was you should have known better. Okay. But why? Because under the naturalist theory, the ability to recognize wrongdoing is universal. You don't need a formal education or a legal degree to understand that hurting others, stealing, or lying is wrong. Okay. These truths are considered self evident, and each person is seen as having an internal moral compass. Y'all, I'm so sorry. I'm losing my voice. My allergies are irritating me. So they have this internal moral compass. I lost my train of thought. So, okay. Um, so in many of these early communities, the law didn't define right from wrong. The law enforced what those in authority already believed was morally right or wrong. Okay. So that means that crime and sin were often treated as the same thing. So violating the law wasn't just breaking a rule, it was seen as failing your moral duty. Okay. And because of this worldview, people were expected not only to know what was right, but to act accordingly. It wasn't enough that you recognize evil. You had a personal responsibility to do good. And if you didn't, the community believed that punishment was just, it was not just appropriate, but it was necessary because they had to maintain that moral order. And the idea carried real consequences. So, like in Puritan colonies, for example, things like, say, adultery or drunkenness or even like missing church could lead to some sort of public punishment. You have, stocks and fines and banishment. These weren't just deterrents, they were real, they were moral corrections. And the legal system was being used as a tool to reinforce what society already believed was righteous behavior. So the naturalist theory gave early communities a shared moral framework, a sort of foundation for law before there were courthouses and constitutions. So it created a kind of legal language everybody could speak, regardless of where they came from or how educated they were. So it's important to understand that while the naturalist theory isn't the only legal philosophy that shaped American law, it was one of the first. It offered settlers a way to define justice, without needing this complex legal system. Because in their minds, justice was already written out on the hearts of men. And it was just that simple. And that belief that we're born knowing right from wrong and that, we're responsible for living accordingly would continue to actually influence the development of American law, even as the system became more formal and more structured. So before we had legislatures or judges or lawyers, we had a shared understanding that some things are just right, some things are just wrong, and it's up to each person and eventually each government to uphold that truth. I know I touched on the growing population a little bit, but just indulge me. So as you have more and more people arriving in the American colonies, The simple legal and moral structures of these early settlements began to strain under the pressure of change. So, in the earliest days, law could rely on a common understanding of morality. Okay. But that worked the best when it was a small, homogenous community, places where everybody shared the same religion, the same language and the same customs. But by the 1700s, those days were gone. Okay. The colonies weren't just growing in size, they were now transforming in complexity. And this population boom brought people from different regions, different countries, and more importantly, from different belief systems. So, with them came a variety of mores and values and rules. So, in other words, different understandings of what is right and what is wrong. So, what one group considered a moral obligation, another might see it as an unnecessary restriction. What one community believed was maybe a serious offense, another might see as it's not really a problem at all. And that created tension. And the tension created legal uncertainty. And you couldn't rely anymore on the assumption that everyone shared that same moral compass. So the naturalist model, where everyone was presumed to know right from wrong, was no longer enough. And in this time period, it became clear that the colonies needed more than just shared values. They needed structure, they needed clarity, and really, above all, they needed a detailed legal system. So this shift wasn't just about a philosophical difference, it was practical. Okay. Commerce and industry was growing. And when that happened, so did disputes. And that's because property rights needed to be clarified, contracts were needed, trades had to be regulated. People began dealing with things like credit and debt and land transfers. And those were not issues that could, be solved with a sermon or a community meeting. These required rules, some very clear, written, enforceable rules. And so the legal system began to evolve from a loose, moral based code into something that was more formal, more comprehensive. And honestly, it was more capable of handling the growing diversity and complexity of colonial life. Um, but it wasn't just the internal diversity that was kind of forcing change. The outside world was watching, and some were preparing to act. And foreign governments, especially Great Britain, they saw the colonies as both a resource and a potential threat. And so there was always this looming danger that another country might step in and try to, claim control. So alongside the push for this legal clarity also came for that push for unity. And the colonies understood that if they remained, scattered and disorganized, and each one of them was operating within their own informal rules and practices, they would also all be vulnerable, okay? Vulnerable to misunderstanding from within, vulnerable to exploitation from outside, you know? So, in other words, without this unity, they could be taken over by force, by policy, by default. And the answer was a move toward standardization, toward organization, toward cooperation, right? So the more detailed the legal system became, the more capable it was of managing not just disputes, but the challenges of expansion, of governance, of defense, all those things. And in essence, the law matured alongside the colonies. So as they grew in population, in industry, and even in importance, their legal needs became too complex for just oral tradition or shared moral codes. So, what began as informal agreements became formal statutes, and what started as moral enforcement became legal adjudication. Okay. And so, before a single, national government had ever been created, the American colonies had already begun the transformation into a society that was governed not just by values, but by law. Now, let's talk about the results of the revolution because this is where it's really at. So, as tensions with Britain grew, the colonies, they found themselves, they were standing at this crossroad, right? And they could continue under their British rule, increasingly burdened by taxes and regulations and government that, was far away and indifferent, or they could take this monumental risk and declare their independence. right? So in 1776, the colonies made one of the boldest political moves in history. They issued the Declaration of Independence. Now, when we think of the Declaration today, we often imagine it kind of as a turning point, like the moment that America was truly born. Okay. But at that time, it was far more symbolic than it was practical. Um, its real power wasn't in what it changed right away, but in what it actually represented. So the Declaration was the first formal and international action that was taken by the colonies as a unified group. You had 13 colonies with very different interests and identities that came together to speak with one voice. And that, in and of itself, I would say is revolutionary, right? But the document boldly announced that the colonies considered themselves free and independent states. They were no longer subject to British rule. Um, but just saying that you're independent and being independent are two very different things. Okay. So at the time of its signing, independence was, in a lot of ways, a formality. Okay. It was a declaration of intent, not just a demonstration of power. The colonies had no standing army, really to speak of. They had militias and they were fragmented and they were poorly armed and they often lacked formal training. They had no navy, they had no treasury, no currency, well, no stable currency, I'll say. Um, and they were about to go up against one of the most powerful military forces in the world, and that was the British Empire. And it's important to understand just how unprepared the colonies were for the war that followed. Okay. Their defense relied largely on a disorganized and underfunded group of farmers and blacksmiths and merchants and volunteers, right? They fought without uniforms, some didn't have shoes, and yet they were committed, right? Not just because they believed that they would win easily, but because they believed that freedom was worth the fight. Okay. So, what the Declaration did accomplish was, unifying the colonies under a common purpose, right? It wasn't just a rejection of British authority, it was a statement of identity, a signal, if you will, to the world that this was, a people. They were determined to govern themselves. Okay. Now, it also carried significant international weight. It allowed the colonies to appeal to other nations for support, especially France, who would become a very crucial ally during the war. But without that diplomatic angle, the struggle for independence might have actually remained more of an isolated rebellion rather than the beginning of a new nation. So while the Declaration of Independence didn't immediately change the day to day realities of life in the colonies, it didn't instantly create a government or in British control either. It laid out the ideological foundation for everything that followed. Okay. It was just the first step in a very long and difficult journey toward building a new legal and political system, one that's not based on a monarchy or inherited power, but on liberty and equality and the rule of law. Okay. And that journey was only just beginning. So, after declaring independence from Britain, the colonies kind of found themselves in a bit of a strange and precarious position. Okay. They severed ties with the king. They fought a war to secure their autonomy, and they made these bold claims about self governance, but they still had no real plan for what came next. Okay. They had achieved their independence in name, but governance in practice, that was still a work in progress, right? So the first attempt to fill this void came by way of the Articles of Confederation. And that was a document that would serve as the blueprint for America's first, national government, right? So the articles were adopted, but they weren't fully ratified by all 13 states until about 4 years later. And they remained in effect until the adoption of the Constitution in 1787, which means for over a decade, this was the official framework of the American government. Okay. Now, it's important to understand what the Articles of Confederation were and also what they weren't. Okay. They were not a constitution in the way that we think of today. Like, they didn't create some sort of strong, like, centralized government. They did the opposite. The articles were written with what would be considered a deep suspicion of a centralized authority, okay, which was a reaction to the very monarchy that they had just rejected. So as a result, they established a loose confederation of the states, each of them retaining significant independence. So under the articles, each state sent delegates to a national congress, but this congress had very limited powers. And those powers were responsible for writing and passing laws, resolving disputes between states, negotiating treaties with foreign nations, things like that. There was a president, but not like the one we know today. This early president wasn't even elected by the people, had no executive authority, couldn't veto, laws, and their primary job was to preside over Congress and handle ceremonial duties such as like receiving foreign dignitaries, right? And the key point is that while Congress could recommend policies, it had no power to enforce them. All right. Let me repeat that. They had no enforcement power. So the Articles of Confederation left most of the authority into the hands of the individual states. And each state had its own laws, its own courts, and its own military forces. So when it came to legal disputes involving individuals, the federal government had no say at all. Those matters were handled entirely by the states and their justice system. Okay. Now, let's also talk about what the national government didn't have, because the list is kind of striking. It had no judges, it had no jails, no power to tax, no national currency, no ability to like raise a national army without the state's consent. And most critically, they had no way to even enforce its own decisions. So even the basic government functions were nearly impossible to carry out, right? Because Congress didn't have a permanent staff. When Congress wasn't in session, which was often, there was no one left to actually run the country. If they needed money, they had to ask the states for donations. But what if a state refused? There wasn't anything they could do about it, right? This system that they had created was slow. It was also fragmented like their militias, and it was ineffective. And states frequently ignored Congress's request. And, then you have trade disputes that break out between like neighboring states and foreign nations that, they don't know who to negotiate with, right? And the government had no consistent military force to defend its borders or to enforce treaties. So, long story short, the Articles of Confederation left this very young nation weak and divided and vulnerable, which is what they didn't want, right? But there were debates about whether, even this much kind of centralization was too much, right? Some delegates, especially those who kind of feared that interstate conflict or long-term like instability, they argued that the individual state governments should be abolished entirely in favor of just one strong national government. Like, they believed that unity was the only way to avoid the kind of internal struggle that had plagued other countries with their fragmented regions, right? But this didn't fly. And it didn't fly because Americans at the time were fiercely protective of their individual rights and their state's identity. Okay. Many had just fought like they bled for freedom from tyranny. And the idea of handing over power to a new central authority, even one that was created by like federal revolutionaries, was unthinkable to most people. So the compromise was this: you have a weak central government that's just strong enough to hold the states together, but it's not strong enough to interfere too much with their own personal affairs. And essentially, it was a noble experiment. Okay. Ultimately, the Articles of, Confederation, they proved to be too weak to govern a growing, changing nation. And they would be replaced in time by the Constitution, which was stronger and more adaptable framework. But understanding the articles, they kind of help us see the learning curve that shaped early American law. There was a desire for freedom, there was a fear of control, and there was an ongoing struggle to find balance between state independence and national unity. So, as the weakness of the Articles of Confederation kind of became clear, a new government structure did begin to take shape, and it was one that would unify the states and protect their individual rights from overreach. Okay. But the questions that the founders had to answer were things like, well, how do you build up a government that's like strong enough to lead a country without giving it too much power that it becomes a threat to the very people that it meant to serve? And that's where the whole concept of protection from government by a few comes in. Um, I just lost my train of thought. Sorry. The American colonists, they had just freed themselves from this monarchy, right? So you have a system where the power was concentrated in the hands of a ruler and a small group of like elites. And so the last thing they wanted was to replace a king with a president who acted like one, or even a Congress that ruled like a tyrant. So the structure that emerged under the new Constitution was designed with balance in mind. The power was to be distributed, not hoarded, and the government would be limited, not absolute. So here's how they did it. They preserved the individual state governments, right? And they did this where the state governments weren't dissolved or absorbed. They remained responsible for handling most of the day-to-day concerns of the people, like public safety, property disputes, criminal justice, local economies. That made sense because the state governments were closer to the people. They could respond faster to emergencies and tailor laws to fit the unique needs of their citizens. But there were things that the states couldn't do on their own. They couldn't manage like national defense. They couldn't negotiate treaties with foreign countries. They couldn't regulate commerce between states or handle immigration policies. And this is where the national government came in. So, under this new structure, the national government was given specific enumerated powers, and these powers allowed it to function on behalf of the entire country, not just one region, not just one population. Okay. And this included managing interstate commerce, which is trade and business that crossed state lines, overseeing Indian affairs, which was particularly important at the time when land expansion was a major issue. Regulating immigration, setting the standards for who could enter and become a citizen, handling foreign policy, which would include negotiating those treaties for trade or even with peace with other nations. And most importantly, the national government had a new and essential mission, and that was to protect the fundamental rights of all citizens. And that meant that no matter what state you lived in, the federal government would serve as a safeguard, a kind of final line of defense against state laws or actions that might infringe on your rights. So, for example, if a state tried to pass a law that restricted the freedom of speech or due process, the federal government could step in. Okay. So, the Bill of Rights and later the 14th Amendment made it clear that individual liberties were not up for negotiation, not even by the states. Okay. So in this new system, the power, it was divided and assigned carefully. Again, the states remained intact. They were flexible enough to manage their own affairs, but the national government handled those broad countrywide concerns and stepped in when states overstepped. And that division wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. It was a deliberate attempt to prevent control by an elite few, to guard against the rise of another monarchy, and to ensure that the government, it remained by the people and for the people. So in other words, the post-revolution government wasn't just a shift in political power. It was a reflection of deeply held values like liberty and accountability and shared responsibility. And those values would go on to shape every piece of American law from that point forward. So, as the framers of the Constitution worked to create a more functional and lasting government, there was one concern that kind of dominated their minds, and that was how do we ensure that no single person or group becomes too powerful? And so the American colonists, they had just fought this revolution to escape the rule of kings, right? They weren't about to replace that with a government that could become just as dangerous. And that's why, the architects of the Constitution created a system that was built around two essential principles, and that was the separation of powers and checks and balances. Now, the separation of powers means that the functions of the government are divided into those three distinct branches. And each branch has its own responsibilities and operates independently from the others. And that wasn't just an organizational choice, okay? This was a philosophical safeguard. The framers wanted to avoid anything that was resembling a monarchy or dictatorship, and separating power was their first line of defense, okay? So we have the legislative branch, which is Congress, and that is the first branch that was established. And Congress is responsible for creating the laws. And this was a deliberate choice, placing lawmaking power in the hands of a group of elected representatives rather than a single ruler. And Congress was structured to represent both the people and the states. It's a bicameral legislature, which means that it has two chambers. It has the House of Representatives, whose members are directly elected by the people, and the Senate, which at the time was composed of members that were chosen by the state legislatures. Okay. And that did change with the 17th Amendment in, I think, 1913. And that allowed the people to elect their senators directly as well. Now, Congress was given the sole authority to make statutory law. That's laws that applied across the entire nation. And that ensured that the will of the people would always play a significant role in shaping the rules that they lived by. Then you have the executive branch, which is the president. And it's the president's job to enforce the laws that get passed by Congress and to serve as the face of the nation in both domestic and foreign affairs. So the president is not elected directly by the people, but through a system known as the Electoral College. And we can have a whole debate about that one day. But it was intended as another layer of protection against the concentration of power, ensuring that there is, a balance between direct democracy and Republican governance. Okay. So the president's powers were approving and rejecting laws that Congress created, right? And the rejection part, of course, is known as their veto power. And even that power is not absolute because Congress can override a presidential veto with, a significant majority vote. President also was to conduct, foreign policy, negotiating treaties, serving as the commander in chief for the armed forces, but most importantly was enforcing those federal laws. And at the state level, the executive role was mirrored by the governors who performed similar duties, within their respective states. And then you have the judicial branch, which is the courts, and it's the third and final branch that was created. And it interprets the law and ensures that it aligns with the Constitution. And the courts kind of serve as referees of the legal system, deciding what laws mean and whether they are being applied fairly. So this branch has the authority to settle most disputes, to interpret laws, and most importantly, to protect the Constitution. Okay. And that includes the power to strike down laws or any kind of government action that they think violates the constitutional principles. So while the Constitution gives the president the final authority to enforce laws, in practice, that's not always the case because the judiciary plays a key role in enforcement by applying legal standards to specific cases and controversies before them. So it's the court's job to determine what justice looks like, not just in theory, but in everyday practice. Now, checks and balances is the other half of the equation. Separation of powers is only the other half. But The checks and balances is a concept that means that each branch of the government has built in powers that allows it to limit or to check the powers of the other branches. And that creates sort of a dynamic system of oversight and mutual accountability. Okay. So, for example, like Congress can pass laws, but the president can veto them. The president can appoint judges, but those appointments have to be approved by the Senate. The courts can declare a law unconstitutional, which, will essentially nullify legislation that was passed by Congress and signed by the president. So, the checks aren't necessarily they're not a sign of dysfunction. They're signs of intentional friction. Okay. They force the branches to work together, to compromise, to stay within their constitutionally prescribed roles. And by dividing the power and giving the branch or each branch the tools to hold the others in check, the founders created a system that they felt was resistant to tyranny and resilient to the face of change. And then, essentially that structure, the three, independent branches, each within its domain with the ability to check the others, kind of became one of the most, I don't know, I guess I would say it was kind of an important innovation in history, in the history of governance at least. It's not perfect and it wasn't designed to be fast or efficient. Lord knows the wheels of justice turn slow, but it was designed to be stable, to be deliberate and accountable. And the founders knew that freedom isn't just about overthrowing a king. It's about building a system where, no one person or group can dominate the rest of that. So where power is shared and where laws, not rulers, have the final say. And that at its core is what the American legal system was built to protect. So after crafting a new structure of government, one that's built on a separation of powers and checks and balances, there was still a concern among, many Americans, and that was what would protect the individual from the government itself. They had just fought this long, painful war to escape oppression, and a lot of them feared that even a well-designed government could still be too powerful, too intrusive, and too controlling. And the solution was the Bill of Rights. And this was a document that would ensure that the newly created federal government could never infringe upon certain essential fundamental human freedoms. Okay? Let me be clear. The Bill of Rights wasn't part of the original Constitution. It came later. It was passed by Congress with the approval of the people as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And these amendments were adopted not because the founders were unsure of liberty, but because they wanted to make absolutely sure that liberty was protected explicitly in writing in ways that no future Congress or president could easily erase. Okay. So the Bill of Rights exists to limit the power of the government and to preserve the rights that were considered, deeply personal, so inherently human that they should never be subject to any kind of political control. Right. So we're going to talk about these, of course, in more detail, especially in constitutional law. It's one of my favorite classes to teach. And we dig into this in deeper terms and, get to express our opinions and stuff. But just a quick overview. First Amendment, of course, is foundational because it's going to protect your right to the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom to assemble, and the freedom to petition the government for change or redress grievances. That means that you can criticize the government. You can practice any religion or none at all. You can publish your views. You can organize protests or movements. And you're supposed to be able to do it all without the fear of government censorship or punishment. And in a democracy, those freedoms aren't luxuries. They're truly necessities. And I feel like we see this more and more every single day. The Second Amendment, of course, affirms the right to bear arms. And the exact scope and limits of this right has been widely debated, but at its core, it reflects the belief that individuals should have the right to protect themselves and their property. The Third and Fourth Amendments, those amendments address your right to privacy in your home and your property. And the Third Amendment is going to protect against the forced housing of soldiers during peacetime. And that was a direct response to abuses by the British military. The Fourth Amendment goes a little bit further and it protects you from those unreasonable searches and seizures. So it makes it so law enforcement can't just barge into your home and take your belongings without having a proper warrant. And the warrant requires probable cause, and it has to be determined by an independent judicial magistrate. It's not just like the opinion of an officer. And the Fifth Amendment, may have heard the phrase, pleading the fifth, and that comes from the Fifth Amendment, which offers other critical protections too, like double jeopardy, the right to not be tried for the same crime twice, the right to not to be forced to testify against yourself. That's a self-incrimination clause. You have the right to not have your property taken without without due process. Um, and due process means that the government has to follow fair procedures before it can legally interfere with your rights. And that is a cornerstone of American justice. The Sixth and Seventh Amendments are intended that if you are, accused of a crime, you can get a fair, speedy, and public trial. You have the right to an impartial jury. You to be told what crime you're being charged with. You get to confront your witnesses. You have the right to a lawyer. And that's actually the Sixth Amendment. I don't know why I said seventh. It's late. But those rights do ensure that the criminal prosecutions are transparent. They're balanced, and the accused has the genuine chance to defend themselves. The seventh is about your rights in trial when it comes to civil matters. Eighth Amendment is going to protect you from excessive bail and cruel or unusual punishment. And that means the government can't keep you locked up without justification, nor can it impose penalties that are extreme or inhumane. I know those are widely subject for debate. And the ninth and 10th, those are sometimes overlooked, but they're just as important. So the Ninth Amendment says that just because a right isn't listed in the Constitution doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So in other words, people still have other rights, and many of them that are still protected, even if they're not specifically mentioned. And the 10th Amendment is the right of the states, where it preserves their rights. And it states that the powers that are not specifically given to the federal government in the constitutions are left to the states or to the people. And that reinforces the principle of federalism, the idea that the government should be shared between the national and state levels. And then together, those 10 amendments make up the Bill of Rights. Again, a document that forms kind of the moral and legal backbone of American democracy. And it's designed to make sure the government doesn't become the kind of force that Americans, fought to escape. Bill of Rights, not frozen in time either. Over the years, the Supreme Court has been called on repeatedly to interpret and to apply these rights in very new and evolving contexts. You've got questions of like privacy, digital surveillance, freedom of expression on social media, the right of the accused in an era of mass incarceration. All of those things have been shaped by how the courts interpret the Bill of Rights today. And in some cases, Congress and the people have even passed new amendments to expand and to clarify protections. Examples would be like the abolition of slavery, the guarantee of voting rights regardless of race or sex, the extension of due process protections through the 14th Amendment. I had one more thing I was going to tell you. All law in the United States, whether it's passed by Congress, whether it's created by agencies, or whether it's interpreted by the courts, it still has to be consistent with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And that is the standard, is non-negotiable. So if the law violates those, it's not going to stand. All right. And that's because the Bill of Rights isn't just a legal document. It's a promise. It's a promise that in this country, the power has limits. I know this is so widely debatable too, that individuals have dignity, and no matter who you are entitled to fairness, freedom, and protection under the law. Again, I know it's debatable, and I'm all for those debates. I actually love talking about this in further detail, but that promise is still to be kept, debated, challenged, and defended every single day. All right, so to understand how the American legal system operates today, we have to look beyond just the structure of the government. We have to look at the ideas behind it, the political theories that shaped how we define and enforce the law. Okay. Now, the Constitution wasn't just born from a single worldview, it was the product of three core legal philosophies: the naturalist theory, the positivist theory, and the sociological theory. Now, we've already discussed the naturalist, and that again is just a belief that people are born knowing right from wrong. Okay. Um, but let's talk about the other two because they both continue to influence how laws are made, interpreted, and applied in the United States. And the positivist theory, under this model, the idea of right and wrong, okay, it's not based on morality or religion or even natural instinct, okay? Instead, it's determined by a single authority, and that's usually the government. So, whatever the government enacts as law is the law, and that law must be followed, regardless of whether or not the person agrees with it. And that theory holds that the law is not up for debate based on personal beliefs or ethical preferences. If a law exists, it has to be enforced and it has to be obeyed, not because it's just, but because it's legitimate, okay? Having been created, through the proper legal process. So in the US, you can see the positivist theory most clearly in action through the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is the court of last resort. It's the highest legal authority in the country. And when the Supreme Court issues the decision, that decision is binding on every other court, every government agency, every citizen, everybody, right? And the only way to overturn a Supreme Court ruling is through a constitutional amendment. And those are incredibly rare and difficult, right? So the heart of the positivist theory is that law is defined by the proper exercise of governmental power, not by popular opinion and not by some abstract principles of justice. So, in that framework, the legitimacy of law comes from who made it and not why it was made. Now, the sociological theory takes the opposite view, and it argues that the law must evolve alongside society. Okay, it's not static, it's dynamic. So the laws under this theory reflect the current needs and values and realities of the people that it governs. So as society changes, so too should the law. And that's why you'll often hear people say that the Constitution is a living document. And it's the idea that comes straight from sociological theory, that it emphasizes flexibility, right? It sees the law as a tool for progress, for social adjustment, for meeting these new challenges. For example, laws about digital privacy or social media speech, cybercrimes, those things didn't exist 50 years ago, but they very much exist now. And it's because society demanded them, right? So sociological theory empowers the people to participate in shaping the law. And if you believe that a law is unjust, you can lobby to have it changed. You can vote for new representatives. You can challenge it in court. But the idea is that the law should serve society and not the other way around. Okay. Now, you might be asking, like, which theory is the right one? And the truth is, all theories work together in the American legal system, and each one kind of plays a role. We rely on the naturalist theory to kind of define basic human rights. We depend on the positivist theory, I hate that word, to maintain legal order and structure. And then we kind of embrace the sociological theory to ensure that the law kind of keeps up with social change. And that brings us to what the judges and lawmakers should be saying they face every day, and that's trying to strike balance, right? And courts are usually the ones called on for this, but traditionally the goal has been to enforce the laws just enough to protect the public while still allowing, that maximum personal freedom for individuals. And that's the traditional balance. That's the ongoing tension between like society's rights and the individual's rights. Okay. But in modern times, that balancing act has become a little nuanced, right? So today, judges have to weigh the need for upholding existing legal principles, those rooted in the Constitution and legal precedent, against the need to adapt laws to reflect current societal values. And that is modern balance. Okay. So consider this, like, how have the courts addressed like LGBTQ rights in recent decades? Because the earlier interpretations of the law didn't recognize same-sex marriage or anti-discrimination protections, right? But as the societal attitudes evolved, courts began to interpret existing constitutional principles such as equal protection and due process in ways that reflected those changing views. And so, but the underlying legal framework of the Constitution itself hasn't changed, right? So, this is the power of the modern balance, is kind of consistency with flexibility, right? It doesn't throw out its foundation every time like public opinion shifts, but it can reinterpret that foundation in ways that are more inclusive or more fair or, more reflective of like the people's needs. I hope all this is making sense. But kind of to put it in perspective, think about how far like we've come. The original government was a single Congress made up of representatives from 13 colonies, had limited roles, a loosely defined president, and one court to serve the entire nation. And today, our federal government includes a bajillion people in Congress. There's so many. I think we're at over like 500 now. You have a presidency that oversees not just foreign affairs, but a vast like administrative state, all these agencies that are underneath it. You have this three-tiered federal judiciary that has, like over 90 district courts, and you've got the 13 circuit courts of appeals, and you've got the US Supreme Court, right? And so those expansions kind of reflect the complexity of modern society, but it also reflects like that influence of the political theories that have helped us grow, right? So the founders didn't just design a government, they created a living, breathing legal system that is supposed to bend without breaking. Okay. So, understanding these theories, it really just kind of helps you understand like how a law is made, how it evolves, and, why it sometimes changes or sometimes why it doesn't. It shows us that a law isn't just about rules. It is about ideas, and those ideas do have consequences. And when we balance authority with flexibility, tradition with progress, and individual rights with the common good, we're carrying out the vision of those early like political philosophers who dared to ask like, what should law be? And more importantly, they were asking, who should it serve? Now, I know I just covered some of this, but I do need to kind of add on to this, concept of balance. And, the founders of our country knew that the successful government, whatever it looks like, can't lean too far in one direction, because one has too much authority and that leads to tyranny. And too much freedom leads to, without any kind of order, it's going to lead to chaos. So again, we have this kind of delicate equilibrium, right? Where laws, powers, and responsibilities are kind of constantly held within that system. Now, again, we talked about the balance and how it shows up in different places, like through the separation of powers and the checks and balances. And we talked a little bit about the traditional balance. And we were talking about that little balance between those competing interests and like the rights of the public as a whole and the rights of the individual. And that's, what the court is kind of tasked with. But I want to add on to that just a little bit because this isn't always an easy task. For example, take public safety laws, right? We want laws that are going to protect the public against like crime, fraud, environmental hazards, things like that. But we also don't want those laws to go so far that they trample on the rights of individuals and like their rights to privacy or due process or free speech, things like that, right? So, this tension, like how far can the government go to protect society without infringing on that freedom, is at the heart of the traditional balance, right? And again, I told you that it's about, kind of evaluating the constitutionality or fairness. And this is where we have to talk about how laws are typically enacted through majority rule. And that means that if most people or most of their elected representatives agree on a law, it's going to pass, right? But the majority rule isn't the end of that conversation because what the majority wants must still be weighed against what the Constitution allows. And again, that's where the courts are going to come in. And if you have a law that gets passed by Congress or by a state legislature, it might reflect popular opinion. And I think we see this a lot, actually. Maybe people just don't pay attention to it. But um, if that law violates the rights protected in the Constitution itself or in the Bill of Rights, then it can, the court can strike it down. So while we kind of embrace that majority rule in our political system, it does get kind of, we kind of temper it with legal principles that protect minority rights and individual freedoms. And that's where we have, kind of some balance. Um, Modern balance also is about law, again, reflecting society and how we enforce, those legal principles that existed decades or centuries ago with, the contemporary society. And again, it goes back to looking at the way society has changed. Like, again, 50 years ago, can your employer fire you for what you post on social media? That didn't exist. Who owns your online data? That didn't exist. What about a text message? Is that a binding contract? That didn't exist. So again, we have to have that balance um, between, the current social and technological, well, and cultural realities too, with the Constitution. So, to kind of wrap up our discussion on balance, I do want to turn back to the three major political theories: the naturalist, the positivist, and the sociological. And earlier we kind of explored each theory on its own, but I want to again take a little deeper look in how they work together, because they are kind of practical cornerstones of our government. Again, the naturalist theory: people are born with the ability to distinguish right from wrong. And again, according to this view, certain rights are inherent, like they're not granted by the government, but they are recognized and protected by it. Um, and we see this theory reflected most clearly in the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution don't give us our freedoms, they affirm that those freedoms already exist. Okay. They serve as kind of a legal shield against government overreach. And the freedom to speak, to worship, to be secure in your home, to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, those aren't privileges. Those are natural rights that belong to everyone. And by writing them into the constitutions, the framers made sure that these rights couldn't be ignored. They couldn't be overwritten by political whims or even changing public opinion, right? So the naturalist theory provides that moral foundation, and the Bill of Rights provides the legal protection. Now, the positivist theory, again, says that a law is created by a legitimate authority and must be obeyed because it has been formally enacted, not because it aligns with morality or public sentiment, right? And the clearest embodiment of this is the Constitution itself. Constitution is our ultimate legal authority. It created the framework for our government, it delegated powers to institutions, and it defined the limits of those powers. And under this theory, it does not matter, again, whether you agree with a law. If it was passed according to constitutional procedures, and if it does not violate a higher law, it is binding. And again, this theory is most accurately represented by our judicial system, specifically the Supreme Court, which does have the power to decide what the Constitution means in specific cases. So its rulings, again, they're final unless they're overturned by a constitutional amendment. And that, again, is that pure positivist logic. The law is the law is the law, right? Because it comes from the highest legal authority. And then that sociological theory, This holds that the law should reflect the changing needs and values of society. And in that model, the law isn't a fixed code. Again, it's a living, breathing system, and it's intended to evolve with time. And that theory comes kind of alive through the role of our elected officials. And our legislators, the members of Congress, the state assemblies, these are chosen by people to represent current public values. And if society changes, we can vote to change the law by electing new representatives. And if we think existing laws are no longer fair, no longer relevant or just, then we can organize, we can protest, we can petition, we can vote, whatever we need to do to push for reform. Okay. And this is what is going to allow also the courts to reinterpret the old principles in these kind of new modern contexts. So, like applying the First Amendment to internet speech, or applying the Fourth Amendment to, or the First Amendment to internet speech. I don't remember what I just said. It's late. Or applying the Fourth Amendment to digital data, right? The core legal principle doesn't change, but the application does. And that's because society has changed, right? So, again, just wanted to kind of circle back to this because I know that your book does, and wanted to just touch on it a little bit more. I know this seems like it's a given, but just going to go over it really quickly. In the American legal system, the law comes in multiple forms from multiple sources, right? So, understanding where our laws come from helps us understand not only how the system works, but also who has the authority to make, interpret, or enforce those particular laws. So, broadly speaking, we have three sources, and that's statutory, judicial, and administrative, right? So, statutory is the most recognizable type of law because it's the kind that gets passed by the legislative bodies like, Congress or the state legislatures. So, if a state enacts a law, then every person and business that is legally present in that state is required to follow it. Now, similarly, when Congress does the same for a federal law, it becomes binding across the entire United States. And these are referred to as statutes, and they usually address broad societal concerns like criminal conduct, employment standards, public safety, taxes, things like that. And once passed, the statute generally remains in effect until it gets repealed, which means that it has been officially withdrawn or it's ruled unconstitutional by a court. And federal statutes, again, have to always comply with the Constitution. Just like the state statutes also have to align with both the state constitution and the federal. So, like, no state can pass a law that conflicts with the Constitution of the United States, no matter what. And that relationship, of course, is governed by the Supremacy Clause. And that's a provision that's in the Constitution that makes a federal law the highest of the land. And when a state and federal law is in conflict, the federal law is going to prevail, right? So while statutes are carefully written, they are also designed to be broad, and it's intended to cover as many potential situations as possible. But there are limits as to how broad they can be. So if a statute is written so vaguely that the average citizen can't tell what behavior is allowed or not, then courts can strike it down, right? The Constitution guarantees people the right to fair notice of what the law demands. So you should never be punished for breaking a rule just because you couldn't reasonably understand it. Then you have judicial law, which is also known as case law. So while statutory law tells us what the rules are, the judicial law tells us how those rules are interpreted and applied in real world situations. Judicial law is created when courts, especially like the appellate courts, they issue rulings on disputes. And judges often review existing statutes or legal principles to decide whether they apply to a specific case. And in doing so, they can clarify, they can expand, or even limit the scope of law. If no statute directly applies to a situation, or if the statute is unclear, then the judge can actually create new legal standards to fill in those gaps. And those legal standards become part of what we call precedent. The principle of stare decisis, which means to let the decision stand, requires the courts to follow previous rulings when the facts and legal issues are similar. And that principle is to ensure that there's consistency, there's predictability, and there's fairness in the legal system. In practice, it means that people can look to past court decisions to understand like what the law is and how it will likely be enforced in the future. But judicial law is more important than just like interpretation because this is kind of like it's like dialogue, between like the courts and society. It's constantly updating how old laws apply in new context. And then you have the administrative law, which is it's one of the most practical and probably fastest growing areas of modern regulation. And in many sectors of our economy and society, like healthcare, aviation, education, trying to think, business regulation, environmental protection. So those are legal issues are so specific and technical that it would be overwhelming for Congress or state legislatures to handle all those details themselves. So this is where those agencies come in. And the administrative agencies are a part of the executive branch of the government. And at the federal level, those agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, like the IRS, the Food and Drug Administration, they help to enforce and apply the laws that get passed by Congress. Agencies do also exist at the state level that handle matters like licensing boards, child welfare, unemployment insurance. That's another one. But administrative law consists primarily of two components. You have the administrative regulations and rules, and these are written policies that are issued by the agencies to explain how laws will be applied. And then you have the administrative decisions, which are rulings that are made by agencies in response to specific disputes or enforcement actions. And these rules and decisions have the force of law. They are not suggestions. They are actual like enforceable legal standards. And failing to comply with those can result in penalties like fines or like a suspension of a license or even criminal prosecution. But administrative decisions, these are decisions that they arise when a person or a business challenges the agency's authority or their interpretation of a rule. So, for example, a company might dispute an EPA finding, right? Saying that they had violated some sort of an environmental regulation. So, when the agency issues its final decision in that case, that decision becomes binding. Okay. And here's what's critical. Again, it has the same effect as law, just like a ruling from a judge or a statute that's passed by a legislature. So, unless it gets overturned by a higher authority, which is typically through judicial review, they are, again, legally enforceable. And that administrative layer of law is honestly, it's essential for kind of modern governance. Um, it allows those expert agencies to apply detailed standards where general statutes kind of leave a lot of room for interpretation. I'm going to make this one quick because I've really already kind of talked about it a lot. But the hierarchy, what happens when we have a dispute that comes up and there's a conflict between the laws and, or you have two laws that kind of contradict each other. Which one do you follow? We have to look to the hierarchy, and the hierarchy is very simple. It is the U.S. Constitution first and foremost, thanks to that supremacy clause. It doesn't just sit like at the top of that legal pyramid, like it forms that legal pyramid. It tells you what that pyramid looks like. And then you have the statutes or the legislative acts that are right below that, which is Congress. And then you have the administrative law that falls underneath that. Essentially, this legal hierarchy is supposed to ensure that power is not just distributed, like it's ordered, it's structured, it's accountable, right? It's supposed to make sure that no matter how complex like the legal landscape becomes, there is some sort of clear guide to determine which rules are going to take precedence and who has the final say. And in our system, where freedom, fairness, and stability are always, in the conversation, that kind of clarity really does matter. And That's it. Again, you've done the hard part, which is listening. Now go make all of this make sense. Until next time.